Good evening. I'm Tony Smith, president of the American Catholic Historical Association, and an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Dayton. Thanks for joining me tonight for another edition of Catholicism Around the Movies, where we explore the intersection of Catholic studies and film. Tonight, I'm joined by my good friend and colleague from the University of Dayton, Dr. Ana Cadegan. Una is a professor of history here at UD and the author of All Good Books Are Catholic Books, Print Culture, Censorship, and Modernity in 20th Century America. And we're here to talk about the recent film Wildcat, directed by Ethan Hawke, about the life or part of the life of Flannery O'Connor during her early years as a writer. When I saw this movie and started to think about this as a possible selection for an episode of Catholicism Around the Movies, I immediately thought of Una as somebody who would be great to have on and to share a conversation with. I can't think of anyone better versed or knowledgeable about American literature in the 20th century, Catholicism and Catholic literature. So Una, thanks a lot for being here. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. So here we are. Let me just briefly say a couple words to contextualize the film, make a few brief comments, and then Una will share her thoughts, and then we can open it up to have an open-ended conversation. So this film was directed by the actor Ethan Hawke. It stars his daughter, Maya, and it has a pretty impressive cast. Laura Linney, Cooper Hoffman, Liam Neeson even has a small role in it. The film premiered in 2023 at the Telluride Film Festival in September, and then it had a limited run last spring, beginning in May 2024. It received mixed reviews. It basically kind of came and went, as far as I can tell, from the kind of indie or art house, whatever that might mean now, the indie art house circuit. It played, I think, for only 1 week here in Dayton, which is where I saw it, and then it quickly left. So it's not a very, I think, well-known movie, but a movie about Flannery O'Connor and her early career and her struggle as a writer that incorporates aspects of her Catholicism and also includes some kind of curious renderings of some of her short stories, makes for, I think, an interesting occasion to think about Catholicism in contemporary movies. So towards that end, let me just make a few brief comments. So first, I can't help but be intrigued by this film about O'Connor as another example of a kind of a long American film interest, perhaps even infatuation with the post-war era of 20th century America. Not so much movies from the 1940s and 50s, but movies about the 1940s and 50s. I don't think it would be too hard to construct a long list of movies about the post-war era, stretching back several decades, right? Good Night, Good Luck, Quiz Show, many of Martin Scorsese's films, LA Confidential, Far From Heaven, Carol, The Talented Mr. Ripley, Capote, The Master, to name just a few. Of course, television, right? Mad Men in particular, and even which another movie I'll make reference to in a bit, the movie Oppenheimer. And there doesn't seem to be any end to this interest in the post-war period. So, for instance, one of the movies that's gotten a lot of kind of talk and buzz and acclaim on the fall festival circuit is Brady Cooper's The Brutalist, which is a story about a person escaping Europe, the war and the Nazis, and coming to the United States and as an architect. First trailer was just released, I think, yesterday. I think this is a movie one context to think about this movie is as part of what might be thought of as a kind of, not even a genre, but maybe a sub-genre. I mean, the film certainly evokes the post-war era, including New York City and Iowa, right? The props of the Partisan Review magazine, the inclusion of Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Hardwick, all evoke a particular world of post-war America in a rather rarefied literary sense, right? It also uses, train stations and trains to set the scenes of, episodes or part of the drama of O'Connor's life. And, train stations like bars and hotel lobbies, as Sigrid Krakauer argued, really were the scenes and places of early and mid 20th century modernity, right? The places of the new kind of places of everyday life of 20th century modernity. They're in this film, right? So, this film very much is kind of a part of this cinematic kind of interest. And, it calls up a post-war world of literary commitment and struggle. And I think it's interesting then to think about this film as an example of that and inserting a certain kind of Catholicism and Catholics, particularly O'Connor, into that, right? In some ways, I really can't help but think about this film in relationship to Oppenheimer, because perhaps because Oppenheimer just came out last year. But both films focus on historical figures. Both films really take the era seriously, or imagines the era in very serious terms. And both, in fact, are interested at some degree or level with kind of middle-class intellectual life. Now, you might say, well, you might attribute this interest in making movies about this era to a baby boomer generational effect. But, Hawke isn't a baby boomer, right? He's for a while there, he was the it boy of Gen X, right? And likewise, Christopher Nolan is also not a baby boomer. So, this seems to be extended beyond just, or explicable only in terms of kind of baby boomer stuff. So those are just some things I've been thinking about. And of course, this movie in that context, again, is situating Catholicism into the cinematic subgenre, I guess. And so to turn to our Catholicism, the film's Catholicism, just to make a couple of points. One is the production context of this film. I think this movie is, and Una and I talked a little bit about this. This movie, unlike the movie Cabrini, right? Hawke and his daughter, Ethan and Maya Hawke are interested, I think, primarily in her as an artist who happens to be Catholic, right? Unlike the Cabrini film, which was made and produced by Angel Studios, that has a real kind of evangelical bent to it. So I think they're very kind of different there. Having said that, there is a lot of Catholicism in this film. And one of the things that strikes me is the use of that very famous line of, revised and resituated from New York to Iowa of what O'Connor's famous line about the Eucharist: if it's just a symbol, the hell with it. And that line, I think, is such a marker of Catholic. It has been used as a marker of Catholic difference, Catholic imagination, Catholic sacramentality, or a way in which Catholics imagine the world differently. Or at least it's been used as one way of imagining the way Catholics imagine the world, right? And here it is in this movie, right? It gets incorporated. This question of Catholic studies, right? Like, what's Catholic here, right? Gets incorporated into this movie, right? It's as if this movie has taken up, maybe inadvertently or by accident, a question of Catholic studies and incorporated it into its own story of O'Connor as an artist, right? And then just thinking a little bit finally about what kind of Catholicism this movie has O'Connor signify, right? In a movie in which, again, I don't think it's intended to be a movie about Catholics for Catholics, but a movie rather about an artist, right? A writer. Here I think, right, O'Connor signifies a kind of serious, intellectual, aesthetic, literate and literary Catholicism. And it's also, a story about a Catholic woman, right? And returning to my earlier point about, this as an example, another example of a certain kind of tendency in American cinema to go back to the 40s and 50s. you don't see too many movies about Catholic artists, and you certainly don't see too many Catholic women who are taking seriously their profession, their vocation, or their craft, right? And so many of those movies, Oppenheimer, Good Night and Good Luck, they're really gendered accounts, gendered renderings of this period. And here we have a story that focuses not only a Catholic, but a Catholic woman, not in connection to a relationship, but rather, well, a relationship with herself and trying to be an artist and a serious writer. I think that's kind of interesting. And then finally, of course, she's not only a Catholic, a writer, but a Southern Catholic, and someone who is both a product of, in a sense, and enmeshed within the Jim Crow South. And I think the movie kind of moderates some of the racial dimensions of the stories, right? Certainly toning down some of the language in the stories it's rendering. And it'd be interesting to hear how people read. Una, what you think about this, like the way it renders the stories. There's a kind of critique of racism that's expressed in its renderings of the stories, but it doesn't really explore her own life so much and her own attitudes in her life. I know there's a big debate, right? Una and I were talking about this, about O'Connor and racism. I'm not as well versed in that literature as others are. It seems to me the movie is very much interested in kind of saving her as an artist, and perhaps doesn't explore some of the complexities of her own life as much. So with that, I'll turn it over to Una.
Thanks a lot, Tony. There's a lot there that I think connects up with the kinds of things I'm thinking about. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And my goal is to raise some questions I'm interested in hearing your responses to. So I'll start with 3, and there are others we can raise if we have time for more conversation after that. I'm interested in people's thoughts on the audience for this movie, and in particular, how it might strike someone who is not very familiar with O'Connor. I have sort of the opposite problem in that I have a very fully formed view of her and her work, and so I think I come at what it presents in a certain way, and I'm interested in how I can't get my mind around how it might land for someone without that familiarity. It strikes me sort of as like going to a greatest hits concert of a band that you've liked for a long time, because you hear the first couple notes of the song and everybody starts singing along because they know it already. And so the stories, as soon as they start off, oh, okay, that's the comforts of home, and oh, okay, that's everything that rises must converge. But what those vignettes look like and how they land for people who aren't all, they don't have the story to kind of echo. Maybe there's nobody like that in the conversation tonight, but it was an interesting choice to focus it that way, to really kind of presume, I think, that people have this deep familiarity already. And if the film strikes you differently from that, I'm interested in that response as well. And then also having to do with the choices of the stories, I was almost confused early on about how they were approaching chronology, because when O'Connor stands up to give what seems to be her first, big reading at Iowa, she reads the story Parker's Back, which, if you've read the stories or biographies of her, is one of her very latest stories. In fact, she was literally still revising it when she died, and she had started working on it a couple of years before that. But it's really from her maturity as far as that went, given her short life. And so using that as like her kind of introduction at Iowa at first struck me kind of discordantly. And I know that when we think about biographical movies, chronology, wanting strict literal chronology is not maybe the best criterion to go by. But I do think if the movie makers significantly alter chronology, it's worth asking why they do that and what effect it has. And I'm still not sure kind of what I think about that, if the movie's focusing on that very early period of when she's coming to grips with her lupus right at the moment when she's breaking through in exactly the way she wanted to, because she really aimed for that high level literary audience and showed what I found to be a very common kind of disdain for the sentimentality of more popular Catholic writers at that moment. And she very much wanted to differentiate herself, as did a lot of other Catholic writers. She wasn't alone in that. And to be published in Partisan Review and Kenyon Review and Sewanee Review at her really young age, I mean, she's already broken into the stratosphere in that sense. So having those very much later stories in this moment could, you could see that as a kind of foreshadowing or echoing of her achievement as an artist. Anyway, that was, for some reason, that was one of the things that, because it wasn't Dust Parker's Back, Revelation, and even the Everything That Rises Must Converge are much later stories after 1960. Maybe that's just an obsessive's point. I don't know, but it was one of the things I was thinking about. Then the third question I wanted to raise, I think, links to what Tony was talking about at the end, and that is I've thought a lot, and I haven't, like, I still think about it. Like, I've thought about it since I first read O'Connor in my own late 20s and early 30s. And it's still a question I puzzle over about the moment when she died. I mean, not only how very young she was, right, at 39, it's still astonishing to me that that's, the whole compass of her life. But because she died in 1964, it's right before what we think of as some of the most momentous changes of the end of the 19th century in both US culture and in the church, right? 1964, 1965 is not only the concluding of the Second Vatican Council, it's also the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And I just have never been sure, and I'm less sure than I've ever been, where she would have ended up, right? The later 60s and early 70s were so transformative to people and people ended up in very different places than they started at the beginning of the 1960s. And I genuinely don't know where she would have ended up. And I think one of the complexities of talking about her attitude toward race is that could have gone in so many different directions. I don't different people have different feelings about counterfactuals and thinking about a future that didn't happen. I don't know, maybe other people don't find that a compelling question. But I think that when I think about the question of race, it's almost as though, I think it's almost a kind of humility and respect to her as a person to just say, we really can't know where she would have gone, and it's very hard to judge that whole, given when she died and how limited in physical scope and geographical scope her life was. And she was so committed to the notion, again, very common at mid-century, that the writer should write only what they know and can see. And so presumably what she would have seen and experienced in terms of America and race would have been so different had she been able to live a bigger part of her adult life out of the South, that I think it's just impossible to predict. So those are three of the things I've been puzzling about since I saw the movie, and I hope people in the conversation have things to say about that, but also that your own questions come out and we can talk about those as well.
Una, thank you so much for those comments. Those are really great. I think they can open up to hopefully some interesting conversation. Yeah, your point about the audience is a really excellent one. I mean, perhaps this is one reason why, it didn't have more of a well, it's always hard to tell why a movie doesn't fail, right? I mean, there are hundreds and thousands, 100 reasons for why a movie fails. But you're right, it is a kind of curious thing. I mean, uh, if you're not familiar with Flannery O'Connor, what might you make of that? That's a great question. Why don't we kind of like turn to what people want to have comments, questions, want to share any thoughts about the film, about what we're talking about, or something else that we haven't touched yet. Let's see. You can Q&A or in chat. No questions yet. As people are thinking about that, Una, I don't want to put you on the spot, just briefly, like the history of her reception as a writer, since her time, then, over the past 60 years, no, what would it be, 70 or more, or 80, just in terms of like, I think about this in the context of the question about audience.
Mm-hmm. I think there was, among a number of Catholic writers in the 40s and 50s, this, and earlier, but in that post-war generation, there was this real desire to break into the mainstream. And I don't think, I think it was a complicated thing. I don't think it was just, well, I think it was very little like we have to show those secular people what we Catholics can do, but it was this sense that that was part of being part of American culture, and wanting to achieve on the terms that that world set. Not, which doesn't mean dumbing down or hiding the Catholicism, but O'Connor was very self-conscious in her strategy about how she thought she could kind of break through that, and she was hopeful. There's a quote that I've used before about the various kinds of prizes that various kinds of Catholic authors were receiving, and having this kind of sense that would fit together with the kind of things that John Tracy Ellis was saying about Catholic intellectual achievement, is that they were actually getting recognition as Catholic writers. I think her reputation built fast, and I'm hesitating only because this can sound cynical, and I really don't mean it to be cynical, but because she mostly wrote short stories, and because she died so young, or because her whole corpus is fairly small, she's very teachable. And I think some of the writers who gain real kind of traction in anywhere other than literary circles is people who can be incorporated into high school and university curricula. And that, I mean, you see that with both and Maya Hawke, because they both came to her as part of reading her in classes. And I think that has really helped to make a wider variety of people familiar with her. And she does cross that line in a way that maybe Walker Percy is the only kind of comparable person. And he, of course, is also from the South, but he's a convert. And he's an interesting case when you think about what might have happened with O'Connor had she lived longer and written more.
Right.
It's early Percy and late Percy is really different from each other.
Right.
So I don't know if that's getting at what you were
Yeah,
at.
no, that does help. Yeah, just this idea of what does it mean to make a movie in 2023 about a creative writer, a fiction writer, and her struggles to wanting to make it in something that gets signified by partisan review and Robert Lowe. What does that mean today? I mean, perhaps it's just real personal interest on the part of the filmmakers. But I couldn't help but think, and this might be just kind of little nuts, but a kind of at a time when is there a literary culture anymore? I don't really know. I do know there's a lot of anxiety, but maybe there's always been anxiety about literary culture. But this idea of bookstores and small publishing houses and literary there's a real assault upon literary culture. Of course, do people read? Another anxiety question. AI around.
Mhm.
Is this a kind of longing for a lost world? You know?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. Yeah, I do think, I mean, I think that's one of the big differences is they still presumed literally a mass culture, right?
Right.
And you could differentiate within that from, the high literary serious people from the popular or even middlebrow people.
Right.
And with, I mean, really with the changes in the publishing industry so that markets are in some ways more targeted, right? Um,
Right.
but it also
Yeah.
multiplies the venues and the outlets. And I remember, I don't know if this is comparable, but I remember somebody saying to me that he talked to Carl Degler, who is a US historian of sort of two
Oh yeah.
generations before
Yeah.
us, saying that he could remember a time when he was pretty confident he read everything that was published in US history in a given year. And he remembers the point where it just suddenly became impossible. There was
Impossible.
just too much. There was no way you could keep up with it. And I think there's something like that in the shift with literary work.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay. So good. So Adrian has a question. As someone who has not read any O'Connor's work, I found the film compelling. It was helpful. It was helpful to be aware of the way the film used excerpts from her stories. In terms of audience, I'm thinking it would be made up mainly of fans of Ethan and his daughter. That certainly heightened my interest regarding the use of Parker's back. I think it was such a visually impactful story, the image of Christ with the wounds from the broom, that the director couldn't resist. Thank you, Adrian. Appreciate that question. Uh, yeah, yeah. Una, do you have any comments to Adrian's question?
That I it only really that is really helpful because the only thing I would add is to admit that I'm aware of a fairly intense personal bias against knowing how a story ends, right? So to me, including the arc of the stories in those vignettes, I think,
Mhm.
but then when the people read the story, they know how it's going to end, and that might not really be a consideration
Mhm.
for other people. And that's why I was curious about what people thought about it when they saw that. So that's,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
agree. I think the way that it was depicted really was compelling.
Right, right, right. Um, yeah, right. I mean, yeah, is this a kind of Ethan and Ethan Hawke and his daughter, right? Um, maybe so, right. This is Hawke does have his, I mean, that does raise this kind of interesting questions about the role of Ethan Hawke in contemporary culture and film culture and using, you know, his status or his resources or his privileges to make this particular film. It kind of does fit in a little bit. I don't really know a whole lot about him, but the little I know is, that sense, as I said, being the thoughtful Gen 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 X. Too many gens, right? So an elaboration of his own kind of persona in the culture.
I
Um,
also, I also think, sorry for interrupting, but I also think it's possible this movie will have a relatively long life online, right?
it could.
That it didn't get a wide release because I could imagine again teachers drawing on it, and all kinds of ways it sort of stays around longer than we might anticipate.
Right. Like, would it be interesting to know what people would say? Like, would you, depending on what you teach, like, would you use this course in a class in American Catholicism on, you know, um, religion and literature, on a course on women in the arts or something like that? So Cecilia has a good, thank you, Cecilia. I'm from the South and we read O'Connor short stories in high school. One that stands out to me, still a good man is hard to find. I read some more of her writing in college. The story I remember is Greenleaf. Recently, I've been teaching the Temple of the Holy Ghost in my introduction to religion class to get students to think about Catholic intellect tradition themes such as sacramental vision. of reality and human dignity. Students don't know her, but they engage with the story pretty well. This really is just a comment. I love hearing you two talk about. Thank you, thank you very much, Cecilia, for your kind thoughts. And it's this Cecilia, I'll just say this doesn't. I'm really happy to hear that you teach her, and it doesn't surprise me at all to kind of get students reading literature again, right? Or for the first time. And that yeah, it is a kind of great way into, a sacramental way of looking at things. Great. Thank you.
And I think Temple of the Holy Ghost is a brilliant choice, I think, for today's students. I'd be really interested in what they had to say about that one.
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't think either of us want to put you on the spot, Cecilia, but any
Yeah,
thoughts,
that wasn't a request.
thoughts about how, that would be really interesting to hear. Bill McNeil, Catholic writer, has been stated often tonight. Is a Catholic writer a writer who happens to be Catholic, or is it a writer whose writings in some way reflect Catholic culture? Could a Catholic writer be a non-Catholic, even a critic? Well, those are all great questions, Bill, and I'm really glad that Una is here with us because she has written very smartly and thought deeply about those questions. So, Una, do you want to thoughts, responses to those questions?
Yeah, this is sort of a be careful what you ask for kind of question, but and I'd be interested in your response to it as well, the person asking the question. But I have written from graduate school on about Catholic literature, and this question was one that American Catholic writers wrote about a lot. And I used to have these minor fantasies about developing a kind of equation that would give you a Catholic quotient, because there was always like the writer did not have to be Catholic, and in fact they puzzled often over why non-Catholic writers wrote sometimes better books about Catholicism. One example that always came up was Willa Cather's Death Comes for the Archbishop. So, which a lot of people agreed was a better Catholic novel than a lot of novels written by Catholic. And there's actually there's a article in Commonweal from, I can't remember what year, where they talked to Cather about why she wrote that novel. And one of her answers was, because I kept waiting for a Catholic to write about this archbishop and nobody did. So I had to do it myself. So they agree that it's not just the setting, it's not just the author. I was thinking about this question just a couple weeks ago because I saw Our Town was performed at Wright State University, and Thornton Wilder was another person that they asked about this, because his novel The Bridge of St. Louis Rey, again, Catholic critics agreed that he got so much right about the Catholicism and culture, and they're like, he's not even Catholic. How come our American Catholic artists aren't writing?
Mm.
So it's the title of my book, not to market self-promote, but was that what came from what I understood the criticism to be in the 20th century, that any good book is a Catholic book, that there's nothing to be gained by drawing the circle too tightly one
Mm.
way or the other.
Mm. Good. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
But if others have responses to that, I'm curious about it. So.
Yeah, right. That would be if people have other things they want to share about that, that would be really great. Uh, let's see. Adrian, I'm curious about Una's thoughts about the role of Catholicism in O'Connor's work, and if you think the film does a fair job representing it.
Mm. Again, when I was both learning to think about literature and then learning about the 20th century history of thinking about literature, the intentional fallacy was something I first learned not to, that was a bad thing, right? To assume that the critic's job was to figure out what the author was intending to do. And that's a funny principle when you think about O'Connor, because her intention was so blisteringly clear. And um, I have worked, I've used various O'Connor stories. I've taught them with students, and I've used them in faculty development work. And that her sense that what she wanted to do was wake people up to the mysteries of the incarnation in the world, um, seemed to some people very mechanistic and kind of manipulative. And that when I first encountered that in my naive younger days, it hurt my heart because I thought that the way she did it was so brilliant. And so I think it depends on who is who the reader is and maybe where the reader is in their own journey. But I found her attempt, especially from such a young age, to try to speak to the people that weren't already prepared to hear her as one of the most interesting things about her. And she had a very uh, I mean, it was a robust notion of doctrine, but she had a very uh, doctrinal purpose, right? I mean, she wanted people to understand and to see and experience the central doctrines of Catholicism. And I don't think the movie is, as Tony I think mentioned already, I don't think the movie is interested in that. I think they're more interested in a kind of general notion of enlightenment. I think they get the Catholic set dressing right. I don't know what other people feel about that. The scene with Liam Neeson, I think, is pretty brilliant.
Mm,
Uh, in like kind of, it's almost like an excavation. It starts on the layer of vapid piety and then gets
right.
down to the real in a way that I think it, it works. And so
Right. Liam Neeson as the priest, but Father Dunn or something, um, hands her like three copies of some devotional tract, and she's like, "Yeah, whatever."
I'm not that sick.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. I thought that was a kind of interesting scene too, right? Um, yeah, good. Okay, so we any more questions there? Okay. Uh, yeah, I mean, I, uh, I mean, if anybody had, oh, another question, good. Um, Timothy Penner, in response to your question about using the film and teaching, I teach courses on Catholicism and film and Catholic literature at a university in Canada. Great. I've used several O'Connor short stories in the Catholic Lit course, and I'm considering using this movie in the film course. What I've always liked about O'Connor's stories is the way she deals with faith in the messiness of the world. And this feels seems to get at that in some ways. Yeah, thank you, Timothy. Appreciate that question. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think uh her yeah, as Una pointed out, so there are some kind of key lines you think of with O'Connor, and I'm not even a deep O'Connor person, um, but it is you do kind of see her grappling with one the kind of conventional pieties of her mother and her what is it aunt, um, and 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 also what it actually means to want to be a writer while also steeped in a kind of devotional culture where that might be suspect, right? A kind of sense of um, really being able to uh, what I don't use the word pride because that's such a loaded word in this, right? But really taking yourself seriously as a writer and being able to acknowledge that in a world in which sacrifice and suffering is so much, and abnegation is a part of this world. And yeah, I was struck by that myself in the film too.
I'd be curious too about what how Canadian students react to the southernness of the stories, US southernness of the stories.
Right.
If you
Yeah.
have anything to
Yes. Yeah. Right. Good. Um, do you have any thoughts, or anybody have thoughts about the ways it renders this kind of literary world? Particularly with um, Lowell and Hardwick.
mm,
It's it's uh, uh, literary people, at cocktail parties. and putting um, O'Connor in that context. It seems, as I said, I think about, there were like Oppenheimer, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting any influence one way or the other, but the sense of like intelligent people together at homes, drinking and talking about important ideas. Right. Again, right, there seems to, I can't help but see a kind of like a nostalgia here for something, perhaps for a certain. So your question about audience is really interesting, Una, because for maybe it's my own projection. For whom might that be attractive, if it is?
Mhm. Well, evidently to Ethan and Maya Hawke, which is an
Right,
interesting question about what they, how they see that world.
right,
I think
right.
there's a lot. I think I saw a fair amount of written about this when Mad Men was showing originally, that there is a lot of nostalgia for the clothes and the sort of more formal dress code of the sort of up through the mid 60s. And I understand that and feel just a little bit of it, and invite anyone to actually try to wear those clothes and see how long the nostalgia lasts. But there is this sense of the kind of elegance of available to ordinary people in that era.
Yeah, right. And then another movie to compare this with too would be the movie Capote, right? With Philip Seymour Hoffman. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
I haven't seen that, no.
And yeah, I actually think it's a pretty good movie. I mean, Hoffman really, I think he won the Academy Award for Best Actor for that, and he really does do a good job. I think that movie is kind of more has a more critical stance towards its subject than this movie does towards Arcana.
Mhm.
But it's another example again of this post-war fascination, but also about a writer. Don't want to interrupt the flow of your conversation, but I'll respond to your question about Canadian
Yeah,
students.
do please.
Yeah, yeah. It takes a lot of unpacking, especially around the use of racist epithets and the shape of Catholicism pre-Vatican II in the South. That said, we get a lot of American media up here, so it's not totally unfamiliar to them. Right. Okay. So, uh, right.
And
Yeah.
I would say in the US, there's a lot of unpacking about pre-Vatican II Catholicism too, that needs to be done. So,
Right. 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 Um, okay. Let's see. Oh, uh, this is from Adrian. I read one review that criticized the emphasis on romance between Lowell and O'Connor, which may have not have existed. I think the cocktail party seems the longest biographical episode, which reinforces Tony's point about nostalgia for an imagined time when the cool people gathered to discuss ideas. Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, that's in terms of her, I don't know. Do you know? I mean, sorry about the dog. Of the actual relationship between the two of them that's intimated in the film, but it's not made central to it.
yeah, I mean, I'm not aware. I didn't go back and try to check on this, to be honest. I think that I don't, yeah, my, when I was watching the movie, I thought it was a kind of intellectual infatuation more more than an implied romance.
Mm,
And I put it in the larger context of just the complexities of somebody from the South being in these important and prestigious Northern and Midwestern places, high culture sort of places, and the kind of attraction and repulsion of the people that she's meeting, because these are the
mm,
places she wanted to go and what she was aspiring to, and the kind of sense, and Robert Lowell is, I think his role is beefed up in this movie in a way that was not so much the case. I think her experience at Iowa was more diffuse, and they put a lot of it into that character. But I could be wrong about that on a number of fronts.
right, right. Okay. Lowell does convert to Catholicism himself, doesn't he? Is that right? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Right. Um, and then he leaves again. Is that right? Or
I
does
think, I mean, if again, I didn't review this, which I probably should have, but I think he struggled a lot with mental illness, and
okay.
Catholicism went sort of in and out based on what he
Mm,
was currently, and I also could be getting him mixed up with one or two other people because there were several different couples that she maintained relationships with even when she moved back to the South. The Fitzgeralds, and then Alan Tate and Caroline Gordon, she had long-term relationships with as well.
right. Yeah. Okay. Right. Um, okay. Let's see. I don't think there's any more questions in the Q&A. Um, Una, is there anything else you want to say um, in light of the conversation or anything else?
I not really. I mean, I could go on and talk about O'Connor and mid-century Catholic writers for a long time, but I don't want to, push it past its natural life right now.
Right. Maybe the one last question to pose to people, and just I suggested in kind of describing this that this film is one example of a recent, a minor kind of resurgence of stories about Catholics within popular culture. Cabrini being one, the documentary on Teilhard de Chardin, and it's curious. I'm sure it's primarily coincidence. Um, but in the past year or so, we've had these works that are attending to and focusing on individual Catholics. And is there anything worth there noting or commenting on? I mean, we seem to be like, this is the October, we're moving to commenting on, dead Catholics in our contemporary moment. Um,
Maybe too soon to tell, but it's an interesting phenomenon to keep track of.
Yeah, I mean, it might just fade out. I mean, as again, I think it's, maybe the data set isn't large enough. But one thing and it's obvious, right? That it suggests something in some ways not, about the range within this particular tradition. You have a Jesuit priest, you have this American Southern writer, and then you have this, Italian saint. Um, and it does seem to suggest, if nothing else, that this is a tradition that is still being mined for a variety of purposes. As I said, right, I think this film is very different than the movie Cabrini, which has very much an effort to an evangelical purpose to it. This film doesn't. Um, and I think you and I know Una talked a little bit about this as we were thinking about this. Uh, the idea of the need for heroes, and it does seem as though within certain segments of well, perhaps in our culture as large, American culture, but then within Catholicism, it's at least American Catholicism, that impulse, I think, is recognizable, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, Longing for saints as superheroes,
Mhm.
right? Which I think really was a kind of intention by the makers of Cabrini.
Mhm.
And I can't help but read this movie, Wildcat, as in some ways a longing for, writers and American writers and artists who could be recognized clearly, you know, as important artists, which is there's something attractive. I think maybe being perhaps a motivation for this movie at a time where, you know, um, culture is just enormously fractured and fragmented, and it's hard to kind of sustain a kind of uh, cultural focus on artists, even the ways that occurred both in popular and literary culture in the middle 20th century. So
Yeah, I think you're on to something that'll be interesting to see how it develops, because I was thinking as we've been talking about this, about there's a whole wave of Catholic focused movies in the 40s and 50s, like Song of Bernadette and
Right.
The Dunn Story and
And
the Bing
Finding
Crosby.
Father Dunn, and
Yeah, the Bing Crosby ones. And
Mhm.
those were, they come out of the studio system where they're genuinely mass media. And the focus there is thinking of Catholics as part of now the affluent post-war movie-going public. And the movies you're talking about today are coming from a very different place because that kind of mass audience just doesn't exist in the same way anymore. And so these films are coming from, I think, a much more personal place, and they're interested in what it is that these Catholic figures have to say in the contemporary moment. But it's different from presuming that there's this mass reach and there's this mass interest.
Right, right, right. And yeah, okay. Let's see. Okay. Well, listen, thank you everybody who attended, and great questions. I appreciate you joining us tonight for this episode about this movie. And Una, I want to thank you very much for joining me and your thoughtful commentary and insights into this movie, and getting a chance to just to talk about film and American culture and Flannery O'Connor. So thank you all very, very much.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good night.
Good night.